All right, so that's a very brief look at intergenerational mobility. Generally, we won't be touching it too much in this course, but it is nonetheless an interesting way of capturing how inequality can be quite stubborn within different societies, or the extent to which it is kind of stuck. Okay, let's look at personal income distribution. The basic idea or structure of any personal income distributional variable is to follow this sort of structure. So first, order every person in society from the poorest to richest, and then group them into percentiles. So you can have 100, different groups: the poorest 1%, the next poorest 1%, all the way up to the second richest 1%, and then the richest 1%. And then you see how much of those, how much income each percentile owns. Or you can group them into deciles: poorest 10%, next poorest 10%, and so on, and see how much they own. Okay, and then simply compare what percentage of income, for example, does the top 1% take or earn from total national income. If the top 1% earn more than 1%, then you already have some notion that there is inequality, right, in your economy. If the top 1% own 10% of national income, then of course, very high inequality. Or you can compare by ratios if you want to capture more of the distribution. So for example, you can compare the top 10% to the bottom 10%. If you divide one by the other, then you will get a multiple which expresses by how much more does the top 10% earn than the bottom 10%. And you can have 80-20, so the top 20 divided the bottom 20, and so on, depending on how you define it. So here we have some data, again, from Our World in Data, another great website, which shows, the total share of income going to the top 1% since 1900 for many of the world's major economies. This data comes from the World Wealth and Income Database, which is a great database for these topics. If you're interested in doing something like that for your term paper, anything with inequality, please do take a look at this website. What we're seeing here is that inequality has followed different trajectories as measured by the top 1% in two different groups of economies. Generally, there's this interesting phenomenon that the English-speaking countries have followed a U-shape over time since 1900, whereas continental Europe and Japan has followed this L shape. So what does that mean? It means that in continental Europe, inequality was high at the beginning of the 20th century. Let's say what we have here, France in red. So in France, more than 25% of total income was earned by 1% of the population in around 1920. Massive levels of inequality. Now, over the course of the 20th century, this has decreased. And for these economies in particular, it has stayed relatively stable since around the 80s or so. But do notice that in the Netherlands, France, perhaps Spain, not really, but at least in France and the Netherlands, we're seeing a slight rise again. Whereas over here, the rise is very much complete. The United States started with 1% owning or earning 20% of total income, dipped after World War II, dipped after massive social programs to reduce inequality, which were then, under the years of Reagan and so on, relaxed or repealed, therefore allowing this massive return to gross levels of inequality. And a similar phenomenon can be observed in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Ireland, and Australia. But nowhere it seems quite as complete a return to mass or stark levels of inequality as in the United States. So here we have clearly an indication that, well, yes, there was a time when economies were getting less unequal, but in recent decades, especially since the 80s and the reforms enacted since the 80s, well, inequality has grown considerably. Here is some data on the 80-20 ratio. Won't go too much into this, but we can see that South Africa in particular, from the countries in the sample, has a massive inequality problem. So the top 20 richest earn 35 times the income of the bottom 20%. What we see is on the other side of the spectrum, it's typically, again, the Scandinavian economies, but also the Eastern European economies, or Central European, that tend to have a much greater degree of equality, relatively speaking. Another interesting and useful measure is what's called the Palma Ratio. Essentially, this is another ratio like 80 to 20, but in fact, it is now the top 10% relative to the bottom 40%. So you divide the income of the top 10% by the bottom 40%. Why? Why this ratio in particular? Why do we give it a fancy name? Well, because Palma in 2011 found that the middle 50% of distribution, of the income distribution, is relatively stable across countries and over time. So this is what we see in the graph over here. This is based on Palma's paper, although it's taken from this website. And we see that across all the various economies we have in consideration, which is actually quite a few, the middle 50%, so the middle class, if you like, perhaps the middle class and the lower sort of capitalist class, in some sense, have captured 50% of national income, and that seems relatively stable across all economies. But all the action, as it's said here, is actually taking place, or the difference is really between the bottom 10 and the bottom 40 and the top 10% of income earners. So here, one of the most unequal economies, again, is South Africa. Quite hard to see, I apologize, but that's what it says here, where the bottom 10%, the bottom 40% has a small fraction of total income, what looks like perhaps 5%, whereas the top 10% have 45% or something crazy like that. And on the other side, we have Romania, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, which by this ratio do much better. So Palma was basically saying, given that the distributional change typically tends to be between the top 10% and bottom 40% of income earners, use that ratio, because it will tell you a lot more about the actual distribution. Again, we have some data for 2015. Again, we see South Africa comes up top in this Palma Ratio inequality measure. And again, we have the Eastern European, Scandinavian economies on the left-hand side with the lowest levels of income inequality by this measure. Germany is somewhere in between. So the top 10% earn 1.1 times what the bottom 40% of income earners in Germany earn. And we have various other economies here. The United States, as we expect, is typically always more unequal than other economies, as is the United Kingdom often. But nothing quite matches South Africa and in terms of inequality. Oh, okay. So now let's talk about the derivation of a very popular measure of income inequality, which you have presumably all heard of by now, which is the Gini index or the Gini coefficient, or simply the Gini. And in order to derive the Gini, we must first speak about what is called the Lorenz curve. So the Lorenz curve, which I think was actually an American economist at the beginning of the 20th century who published a paper on this, essentially tells us the deviation of our distribution from total equality. So the order in which you construct this graph, which we'll get to soon, is as follows. Again, order every person in society from poorest to richest. Work out what share of total income or wealth each percentile earns. And then, using that data, you graph the cumulative percentage of the population on the x-axis, and then you have the percentage of income or wealth on the y-axis. And what we would expect in a completely equal society is that, say here, 1% of the population earns 1% of, in this case, income, 2% of the population earn 2% of the income, and 100% of the population earn 100% of income. So that's what we mean by cumulative here. We're adding up the percentage as we go along. Of course, no economy is equal in this, or so equal, not so absolutely equal, far from it. Typically what we expect is some deviation from this line of equality, such that, let's say, well, 50%, the bottom 50% of the population earn, let's say, 20% of total income. And then as you get further to the right, we expect that this curve to get much steeper, as a lot of income is basically captured by the top of the income earners. So the Lorenz curve graphically depicts the distribution and how far it deviates from total equality. And this is where the Gini coefficient comes in. It essentially captures the Lorenz curve in a number. Essentially, it is defined as follows. The Gini is a number given by the area between the line of equality and the Lorenz curve, divided by the total area under the line of equality. Yeah. Now imagine the extreme scenarios. If the Lorenz curve depicted absolute inequality would be where one person owns 100% or earns 100% of income. So the Lorenz curve would basically look like a backwards L. Yeah. So it would be flat up until here, and then the last person up here would make the line shoot up. And in that case, A would be the size of, well, A plus B, right? So what we would have is A plus B over A plus B is 1. Or in other words, B would be 0. So it would be A over A, I should say. So that in that case, we have a Gini of 1. So that's why absolute inequality is represented by a Gini value of 1. Yeah. On the other hand, if the Lorenz curve was essentially overlapping the line of equality, it shifted as far as possible to the line of equality, then we have, well, A is 0. There is no difference between, there is no area between the line of equality and the Lorenz curve. So absolute equality, where everyone has the same income or wealth, is represented by a Gini coefficient of 0. Of course, we don't really expect to find 0 or 1, but just keep in mind that the closer to 1 you are, the closer you are to, well, absolute inequality, the more unequal your society, your economy is. To really codify what we have spoken about here, I would like to give an example for the UK, because that's what I found data on, for wealth, because we haven't been speaking as much about wealth in this lecture. So this should hopefully give you a better idea of what the Gini is doing and how to construct it. Because a lot of time students can feel a bit disassociated or detached from this number that you get that supposedly represents inequality. Well, here we have some data that I got from the Statistics Office of the United Kingdom, and it has different periods, typically 2-year periods, and it has the wealth owners separated into deciles, so into groups of 10%. And what we see is, well, say in 2006, 2008, the bottom 10% actually owed more than it owned. Yeah, it had more debt than it had assets, savings, and so on. So so that's quite a fascinating maldistribution, if you like. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the top 10% owning 43, close to 44% of all wealth in the UK. Right? So here we already see that wealth in the UK is quite radically unequally distributed. But this isn't our Gini index yet, right? We need to do something with this data in order to turn it into a Gini index that represents just how unequal the distribution is. So what I'm doing now is simply taking the last period of analysis, the most recent one. I've just put it in vertical form. And what I'm doing here is simply well, finding the cumulative total. Because remember, the Lorenz curve expresses the income earnings in a cumulative way, right? So this is simply, as you see here, just adding as you go along, just adding what we had before. And of course, at the end, oh, I shouldn't do that. Okay, my apologies. It's just adding in a cumulative fashion what has gone before. And using this, we can plot our Lorenz curve, right? The equality line is simple to compute. It's simply for the bottom 10%, we'd expect them to be earning 10% in a perfectly equal society. The bottom 40% should own 40% of wealth in a totally equal society. So that line is very easy to implement, right? Okay, and our Lorenz curve bends below it. So all we need to do now, according to the Gini index, is find the area between the line of equality and the Lorenz curve and divide it by the total area in this triangle, if you like. So it's easy enough to do. We can simply find the area under the Lorenz curve, say here. I've reprinted it again, but now I'm saying, well, if I want to find the area between the 9th and 10th decile, well, I've got a trapezoid and the function for the area of a trapezoid is given. I know that this height here is 10 because it's 10 percentage points. And I know the height here, that's my A, and I know the height here, that's my B. And so I can simply find the area given that function. And so the area is given here, and the area then underneath the whole Lorenz curve is just summed up. And then in order to get the area between the Lorenz curve and the line of equal distribution, I just take the total area under the equality line, which is of course the area of a triangle, 100 times 100 divided by 2, and I subtract it, right? So that's the area between the Lorenz curve and the equality line. Here again we have our Gini formula, and so simply we divide this number by the sum of this, right? This number divided by A, or this plus this. So we find that our estimated Gini coefficient for wealth distribution in the UK between 2016 and 18 is 0.6. Remember, the closer to 1, the more unequal. Just to compare this to the official estimate, 0.63. Wow, okay, that's a pretty good estimate, right? Given that we haven't broken this down by percentiles or smaller groups, we are going to deviate a little bit, but we save some work in the process and get a reasonably good estimate. So here we see that inequality in terms of wealth in the UK in recent years is quite massively unequal. And generally what we see, or what we tend to find, is that inequality in terms of wealth is always greater than inequality in terms of income. Wealth tends to be more unequal than income. Here we see the Gini in terms of income inequality for advanced economies. And basically since 1979, we see that income inequality has been increasing for all, virtually all economies that we have in the sample. Although France is always a bit of an outlier in terms of inequality, it seems to have leveled off quite a bit. Italy has increased in terms of inequality. Netherlands a little bit, perhaps. Czech Republic, Norway, and so on. Why have I have displayed the image as such is because I wanted to show you the difference between the market income, which you see here, and the disposable income, right? Because of course, market income is before tax, disposable income after tax. So of course, we'd expect disposable income to show less inequality than, so a lower Gini than market income. So we can see in Norway, for example, a country that tends to redistribute quite heavily or strongly, is that there's quite a massive gap between market income and disposable income, right? So in fact, the Gini has been rising. There's been growing inequality in Norway in terms of pre-tax income, but the Gini index in terms of disposable income is quite similar, right? 0.25 in the last period of analysis and 0.23, so very small increase. For various other economies, there's a similar story. Of course, the Gini is lower in terms of in comparison to market income, and it's less starkly increasing. Although for the United States, for example, the United Kingdom, there is certainly increases in inequality over the last few decades. Okay, before we go into functional income distribution and wrap up, a brief comment on the limitations of the Gini coefficient. Look at this first graph. We know that comparing these two Lorenz curves, that's the light blue one, shows a more unequal distribution. That's pretty easy to compare, right? This economy is more unequal than that one. That's kind of unambiguous. In this case, however, we have perhaps two economies or the same economy in 2 points in time. And the Gini could in fact be the exact same, right? Because it's simply the area here divided by the area as a whole. And so long as the area captured between the line of equality and the Lorenz curve is the same between the two Lorenz curves, it will give the same Gini. So there could be changes in the distribution of income that the Gini simply cannot pick up. It fails to pick up. There are other limitations of the Gini coefficient, which we won't go into, but this is a sort of fundamental one. Is simply that it doesn't show all changes in income inequality that we might be interested in. And it's also less convenient to read or to interpret compared to, say, the income going to the top 1%. So if you're not a big fan of the Gini, I understand. There's a lot of other critics as well. And I guess I would count myself towards them in many ways. Okay, last notion of inequality or income inequality and how to measure it is in terms of functional income distribution. You may have come across this before. I'm sure some of you have. We have the wage share, which is the primary way in which we can measure functional income distribution. Remember, functional income distribution is simply measuring inequality in terms of the functions performed in society, typically divided just between workers and capitalists. And the wage share, which is also called the labor share, means the same thing, is simply all income derived from labor divided by the total national income. If you want to express this as a percentage, then times 100. Now, how can you get all the income derived from labor out of the national statistics? Well, often we simply take the compensation of employees and add some estimates of the labor part of mixed income to that compensation of employees. Because remember, there are a lot of self-employed people in the economy, and they will be counted as part of mixed income because their income is not purely from labor, it may also be from their own use of capital, right? Their own machinery, their own cars, their own buildings, and so on. So this can be a little bit tricky to estimate, but there are rules of thumb typically that are used to find some notion of, well, the parts of mixed income that is due to labor. And you add that to the compensation of employees, and then you get what is called the adjusted wage share, where the denominator representing total national income is most often GDP at market prices or effective prices. You could equally speak about the profit share because it's just 1 minus the wage share. If the wage share was in terms of a percentage, then it's 100 minus the wage share as expressed as a percentage. If you have data on the wage share, you have data on the profit share. It's one is the inverse of the other. Okay. And why is it useful? Well, because it expresses in one number a measure of inequality which is relevant very much still today. Because, of course, capital tends to be held by relatively few in the population. If capital was owned equally across the population, then this would be perhaps a meaningless measure, or at least not a very useful measure. But, of course, capital is not. So we can derive a measure of distribution from the national accounts itself, which is extremely useful for our purposes. And here we have some data. This is data I pulled from Amico, which generally has some of the best data on the wage share. This is from the European Commission. And we see that for major economies around the world, here I have, by the way, averages between 1960 and 2019, all 5-year averages. Right? So I just easily constructed them in Excel and then pulled them into R so that I can have an interactive graph. But typically, I mean, realistically, you can do this all in Excel. And we see, well, the wage share has been decreasing, right, since the 80s. And this is generally the trend across most of the major advanced economies around the world. So the same is true in Canada. There's a massive fall between 70 nearly and 62. In the Euro area, we see, a similar fall. Perhaps I'll just get rid of this for a second. Which is quite remarkable given that, well, the Euro area 12 is, well, constructed of 12 countries. There could be different things going on, but the general overall trend is certainly a downward one. Japan, again, remarkable downward shift. So the laborers are getting less of national income, and the US, as is typical with all inequality measures, has become much more unequal as well. The only country that's in the analysis I found was relatively stable, at least in recent years, is the UK. Although in many other measures of inequality, the UK has grown much more unequal too. Okay, so we see that by functional income measures, the world has become a lot more unequal. Labor, despite being a massive part, despite being the majority of the population, is increasingly getting less of total national income. Okay, so to sum up, to offer some conclusions, there are many ways at looking at inequality. We consider the familial, the personal, the functional, and we've seen that for major advanced economies in particular, since at least the 1980s, the trend has been towards much more unequal distributions in terms of income, but also in terms of wealth, which we considered less here. But we saw the example of the UK, which was quite remarkably unequal. And generally that tends to be the rule. Wealth inequality is greater than income inequality. We have discussed how the Gini coefficient is constructed. We have discussed its limitations. And we have seen alternatives to it, like the Palma Ratio and functional income distributional measures of income inequality. Lastly, we have noted at the very beginning that, well, this gross inequality, this trend towards inequality, may be problematic for intrinsic reasons, but also instrumental reasons. And we're going to focus more on these instrumental reasons in time to come, in the weeks to follow, and see what kind of effects this income inequality may have on other variables that we're definitely interested in. There will be a video on, so that's Wednesday. On Wednesday, there will be a video on the causes and what we can do about this inequality without looking at the instrumental reasons, what effects inequality has on other variables. We're just going to be looking at, well, what is causing this widespread inequality and what we can perhaps do about it from a policy perspective. Okay, I hope you found it interesting. I'm very much looking forward to discussing these topics and the drivers of inequality on Thursday with you all. Please, as always, send me a message, send me an email or use the forum if you have any questions at all. And if you don't, well then I'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye for now.